So we're going to talk about technical interviews today, um, which is going to lead into like showing this basically technique that's pretty much commonly taught on how to tackle like what's a large chunk of the technical interview process, which is called a whiteboarding problem, which can mean a range of things, and I'll talk about that too. But and I'm gonna demo a little bit of Leak Code. I know we've been doing some with it. Some people have used it before. It's newer to some people, so I'm going to do just a little walkthrough of the platform as well, so we're all familiar. So we're going to talk about technical interviews. We're going to talk about how to succeed at whiteboarding problems. Francisco is going to interview me for a little like mock technical interview with a Leak Code problem, so you can see me like practicing that process for real, warts and all. And then all of you will work on a simple Leak Code problem for like a timed amount of time, probably 30 minutes, to like practice this process. And then if there's time, we'll pair you up and you'll work together. Because you'll find that even for problems where you're like, oh, this is simple, it turns out that like when a clock is ticking, it's tougher. But first, let me kind of explain why we're doing this all to begin with. So the software engineering world, as you are discovering, like software engineering and writing code and programming is a lot of fun. It's also a lot of work. You know, it's not rocket science when, you know, all people out there are like, oh, learning to code is easy and fun. There's a lot of truth to that. It's also a lot of work as well. It's a profession. And I like to use the analogy of like being a doctor or a lawyer. And the reason I like to use that analogy is because doctors go to medical school and lawyers go to law school, but where do software engineers go for graduate school? They really don't go to software engineering graduate school. You can get a master's in software engineering or computer science, but it's really like a one-year professional degree for people who are already in the industry, and it can have value, but it's by no means a standard. Doctors have to pass official exam. There's an official licensing group. Same with lawyers, they have to pass the bar. Mechanical engineers, like pretty much any other kind of engineer, also has to actually get certified. And in some countries, you actually do have to get certified to be a software engineer. But generally speaking, software engineering like has none of that sort of like credentialism. The closest we have to that is a computer science undergrad. And even there, employers figured out very quickly that just because you have a CS undergrad doesn't mean you are going to be a productive programmer and software developer. What we do have is, so what essentially happens is a lot of that education that like if I was a doctor would happen in medical school happens on the job. And there's very roughly this sort of guild system of like junior developer, mid-level developer, senior developer, where like you're expected to be able to handle more and more kind of independently and figure stuff out and deal with like more complex tasks. And, you know, to use the carpentry metaphor, it's sort of like going from like a carpenter, you know, who's going around hammering nails where they're told to, all right, maybe I get to sort of design and build the door frame, to like eventually maybe I am helping to design the whole house. So a lot of learning happens on the job, and there is no like official credentialing. So we have to go through basically an audition process, and that's the technical interview, for better and for worse. And, you know, if I was to go back on the software engineering job market tomorrow, I would have to spend some time, you know, like jamming on Leak Code problems and doing a lot of Leak Code problems and studying up on my data structures and stuff like that, because those aren't things that I use, that most, not all, but many software engineers don't use on a day-to-day basis. But they are things that are a common part of the technical interview process, which is essentially an audition. And the interview process looks something like this. First off, there's going to be a resume screen where simply an automated system or a person looks at your resume. It's usually an automated system these days, an applicant tracking system. and you get to the point where you can actually apply. What may also happen upfront for some companies is a coding challenge on Leak Code, kind of like you all did to get into Code Platoon. The problems here are generally actually not that hard. You'd be surprised how many people are out there applying to software development jobs who can't code their way out of a paper bag, which isn't even an exaggeration. And so you all are ahead of the curve on that one. But this is not uncommon. And then you would have, like, say, technical interview round 1. And I apologize, I need to update the formatting of this doc so that these bullet points appear on different lines. But this first round interview, it's usually an hour, and it could be a technical conversation where you talk about a project that you've worked on or a technology that you like. And it's usually companies, sometimes it's an engineer from the team doing the hiring. Sometimes companies, they pick like sort of their senior engineers and they do the interviewing. So it really depends. It could be, sometimes it's sort of like a code review where they're like, show me the code for a project that you've been working on and let's talk about it. The round 1 interview could also be a programming problem, a whiteboarding problem, where you work on a programming problem for an hour with your interviewer. After you finish that first round, there is usually another round that happens. You know, it could be a week later, it could be a couple days later, it could be 2 weeks later. And again, it could be a technical conversation or a code review, another programming whiteboarding problem with a different person. Some companies do a take-home programming project, which is basically a weekend project where they always say it shouldn't take you more than 4 hours, and it always does. Where you're basically asked to build an app and they want to see best practices. And this is where being familiar with tests will pay off. And they want to see you deliver on time and communicate well and so on. You may have a 1-hour behavioral interview. The order of these will vary from company to company. And then like the final round interview, which sometimes at this point is just a non-technical conversation, maybe with the VP of engineering. That's sort of like a gut check, and here you can kind of ask questions about the company and career growth and stuff. What also can happen, like the final interview in the pre-pandemic days often was what's called an on-site. Not every company does this, but it's not uncommon for startups, and all the West Coast tech companies do this. I'm sure there's a remote version of this, but the in-person version, which I've done many times, is you come into the offices of the company around 9, and you basically have like 4 hours of back-to-back technical interviews with people. And maybe you go to lunch with the people on the team you might be joining to see how you all get along. And then after the lunch, you there's usually like a brief, like informal chat with like the CTO or something. And you know, the on-site, you're not going to do a 4-hour on-site after like 5 rounds like that. Like if a company has an on-site, they might do like 1 or 2 rounds, and then they're like, all right, cool, let's bring you in for the on-site, and that's the final round. And in on-sites, I have pair programmed. I have been asked questions about HTML. I have been asked to do, I think there was once something with a tree. I have been asked to write JavaScript on a whiteboard. I've been asked to just like, you know, like code up some React.js stuff. There's a huge range of stuff that you can be asked to do. And that is part of the challenge. So when I say audition process, I'm not kidding. And I do want you all to realize that it's a significant amount of work to prepare to be successful at these, but I don't want you all to freak out. There's a huge range of how companies do this. Most companies do not make this incredibly difficult. You know, companies like Google and Facebook and Netflix are kind of known for this process being challenging. some companies like to make it hard because they think that we're so smart that we only get really smart people. And then it's like you go through this crazy process and then you're doing the same web dev as everywhere else for a lot of jobs. A lot of companies only have like 1 or 2 rounds. But this is an audition and you are being assessed. Excuse me. So let me just pause here and kind of see what questions or thoughts people have about this whole sort of like big picture thing before I move on. I'm
I have
looking
a
in.
question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Um, so I did like more physical tech in my background, and with that, even though some people said they were worth it and some people said they're unnecessary, I know there's like certifications like AWS, and I think Google might have some as well. Are those helpful, or are they just like, maybe not?
Yeah, I think it's more of the second category of maybe not. Um, Excuse me one moment. Um, they can be, I think, a little helpful for the resume screen. Excuse me, Clarice. I had to cough there. Uh, um, Honestly, for a lot of you, the resume screen is going to be just as hard as everything else because there's a little bit of the you need experience to get experience, and everyone wants to hire people with experience thing going on in the industry. The good news here is that like once you get that 1 year of experience, it's sort of your calling card or your union card. So for some of the bigger companies, having some like an AWS cert or something on your resume may help a bit. Some of the certs, like there's a Linux cert that's quite good. Some of the stuff you'll learn with like the AWS Cloud Practitioner cert certainly isn't bad, but I think it's really questionable to what degree those matter. The weird thing about the software world is it's almost like anti-credential. Like people want to see like your projects and the code that you've written and your demos and like where you've worked. Um, and there's good reasons for that, and then there's bad reasons for that as well. But like some certifications can help, but honestly, by far, I think like it's going to be like networking and actually talking to people, and having a strong portfolio and having a good technical foundation so that you can succeed at the interview process that are sort of the priorities. And then I would put like a cert after that. Yeah, that's a great question. There was a comment in the chat too, like every job has like 10 interviews. Sort of, yes. It's more like 3 to 5. I think I did one job that had like 7. They had a lot of behavioral interviews because it was a consulting company. Francisco, I think you might have done one. I think I remember you saying with like 6 or 7 once. That's a lot. That's the most. And honestly, at that point, it is a little ridiculous. But 3 to 5, with 5 being at the upper end, I think is about right. Three is a reasonable average. Like really, a behavioral, like 1 or 2 technicals, and then sort of like the final round interview, which is has a technical component. Is how I would think about it. 3 is probably a decent average. What other questions do people have, or things that people are curious about? Cool.
I
So
have another question.
yeah, please.
I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
Um, I know in this course, we're generally supposed to be looking at like more full stack, maybe front end or back end type positions. But is there more types of software engineering we could look at for application?
That's a really good question. I would say it's fuzzy, to be totally honest. Um, like and the terms like back end, that covers like a huge range of stuff right there. To be honest, because like what you're doing, like writing like server side or backend code, um, it can depend a lot depending on what the company is. I think especially with like the government contracting sector, we've seen some people get hired for other roles. Um, there there are other roles out there. We'll talk about that, I think, a bit more when we get closer to the end of the course, because it's just a whole bunch of sort of specifics. There's no one general answer. It's like this type of role is good, this one isn't. Um, but yeah, generally speaking, like front-end engineering for web apps, back-end engineering for web apps, or full stack, which is the combination of the two for web apps, are sort of like the bread and butter. And those cover a pretty wide range of roles. Um, it depends on the other kinds of software engineering roles. For some, the experience, like the skills you learn will translate. For others, like for example, data science, machine learning, those are their own specialized like skill sets with their own like technologies and stuff that you have to learn. So it just, it'd be like applying for a job to like translate Japanese into English when I hadn't learned Japanese yet.
What about like, I know there's like maybe mobile engineer. I don't know if that's just apps or game engineer. Would we have any of those sort of skills built up by, I guess, or close enough that we just need a little bit more to get there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I got to kind of tackle each of them separately. So mobile engineer, that's like, I'm writing an app on iPhone or Android, and I am writing it native for that platform. So I'm using like Java or Kotlin to write it for an Android app, or Swift or Objective-C to write it for an iPhone. And there's some overlap. There are some skills that translate, but it's a little bit of a toss-up. I think you'd have to do a bit extra to be able to be competitive. Because like all of this stuff does start to get pretty specialized pretty quickly. Some companies will have more of an appetite for hiring someone and training them up if they see like, hey, this person's talented, they can learn well. Other companies are like, no, we want someone who knows this stuff and can hit the ground running. So like, for example, there's something called React Native that is like, you can write React with JavaScript and have it be a mobile app. And if one company writes their mobile app using React Native, then they might be all about, hiring a code Platoon grad who knows React really well. Another company, they're like, hey, our mobile app, we're using Java for the Android app and like Objective-C for the iOS app. So we need someone who knows those languages. A lot of these concepts translate, but that's where like the specialization in terms of doing this professionally does start to kick in. It's not a huge amount of work to sort of skill up if you're interested in those areas, but that is sort of like its own task. Yeah, and that's something too I'm happy to talk about more later and after the lecture or just as the course goes on, because a lot of people are curious about that, like how do these skills translate, and we will continue to talk about that. I do want to keep rolling just to make sure that I get to sort of the heart of the talk today. So this interview process is like really about and actually to go back to your question, Clarice, like a lot of the fundamentals translate, but then it's kind of like all right, I know how to program, but now I need to learn like this language, which is way easier once we've learned one language well. Or like, all right, now I know like React, but I need to spend some time learning whatever framework is used to build, an Android mobile app. So like this interview audition process has evolved over time. Like it used to be sort of in person, and you were writing code on a whiteboard to solve a computer science like data structures algorithm problem. That was like pretty much how most of these interviews originally worked. A lot of the times you're writing code on a whiteboard these days, and it's like a pretty straightforward problem that's not really dealing that much with data structures or algorithms at all. We might not even be writing on a whiteboard because these days it's often over Zoom. What's not uncommon though is an interviewer might open up a Google Doc and say, all right, let's write a simple program to do this. So all of a sudden, instead of LeetCode, instead of sharing your screen and writing your code in VS Code, you've got to write your code in a Google Doc, where obviously you don't have autocomplete and all these helpful tools. And this would be a really pretty simple problem, but if you don't have like a strong fundamentals with the programming language in question, then that's going to be tough, right? And that's why, above all, like really being comfortable with like your programming language is important. And actually, as to your point, Clarice, like once you graduate, you'll want to pick what language you interview in. It is tough to do both for programming problems. You generally want to choose one because you want to know it really well. So the purpose of this interview is the interviewer wants to see how you think, because once we get hired, there's going to be a lot of mentorship that happens. Like when I joined Reverb as a mid-level engineer, I got assigned a senior engineer as a mentor who did a lot of one-on-ones with me, and that's even more so for junior engineers. I was somewhere between like junior and mid-level there, really. So interviewers, they're really looking for like learning ability, ability to receive feedback, ability to talk about technical stuff well. Like no one wants someone on their team who like is absolutely convinced that they're right and everyone else is wrong, which is an easy trap to fall into with technical stuff. People also want people on their team where like, hey, if like the senior engineer on my team is wrong about a technical issue, I should be telling them, because this stuff is way too complicated and no one's perfect. So it's like that good communication skills. So this technical interview is like 60% process, 40% solving the problem. You can still get hired if you don't finish the problem in time and you don't complete it. Completing it is great, but if like you are talking through your process of how you think about stuff and work through stuff and communicating well with the interviewer, that's a huge plus. So how do we succeed at these things? There's really, I think, two things to understand here. The interviewer is not your enemy, they're your ally. A Sierra Platoon student said it, and we liked it, so we put it in the curriculum. And that's really true. Your interviewer often will maybe help you and give you hints, because they want to see how you collaborate. That's part of what the interview is about. And so that's where all this pair programming and stuff really starts to, I think, help a lot. And all of the demoing that you all are doing in stand up and stand down, which is awesome. And getting comfortable talking through code. So the interviewer is definitely not your enemy, they're your ally. In mock interviews, a lot of the feedback we get is, I expected the student to ask more questions. You're expected to ask questions in the interview. You're not expected to like figure everything out 100%. Like sometimes you have to ask questions about stuff. If you do well in an interview, they tend to throw more at you, which can be a little off-putting. So to succeed at these things, remembering the interviewer is your ally, and treat this like an audition where preparation and practice are essential. Years and years ago, I actually taught like GRE test prep classes for Kaplan test prep, which is the standardized test for grad school, which is standardized tests are a whole thing. But one thing I thought that the company did well when I was teaching these is like there was like a whole process that we encouraged like students to practice about how to work on every question, and like the night, like 2 nights before the test, like you should get enough sleep, and like all this stuff that was scripted out. And I think a lot of that sort of process is valuable. Like not like unlike again, if you're playing a sport or if you've like been in like a band or a play or anything, you have to prepare, you have to practice. Um, you should be communicating in advance about it to make sure you know like the rough outlines of the problem. And I'll talk more about that later. Today, I do want to get through to the main points of how to do this whiteboarding problem. Let me open up VS Code here for a moment. Everyone, is this font size okay for everyone? Actually, let's do it like this. Because I wrote this like super comprehensive list here, and I'm going to kind of summarize it. So basically, this is your process. Read the question out loud. It buys us time to make sure we understand the question. It starts the conversation with the interviewer. You want to be talking out loud your process as you go. Don't make assumptions about the problem. If you're not sure about something, ask. The interviewer will help you. Their goal isn't to confuse you with the question. They want to see how you implement the code. Take some notes. Inputs, outputs, edge cases. Write pseudocode for a simplest case solution. Oh, that is not what I wanted. Don't write pseudocode talking about the problem, write pseudocode for the solution. Come up with some really simple fake data to use for your pseudocode. Write the pseudocode. Talk through your pseudocode algorithm for our fake data. Just the way that we've been doing in these stand-ups and stand-downs, talking through what the code is actually doing for a really, really simple case. Do this with your pseudocode, because I don't want to worry yet about like accessing dictionaries or creating classes or anything like that. I want to just get my big picture approach laid down. Ask the interviewer if they have any thoughts, if that makes sense, right? You are working together on this problem. You are explaining like what approach you think is a good way to solve the problem. The interviewer may give you feedback here. They may say, yeah, it looks great, let's go for it. They may say, it looks good, but how would you handle this? And that's sort of a hint that there might be something that you're missing and they're helping you. They might, depending on the interviewer, they might just say, let's code it and see, you know? But you want to be communicating as much as possible. And remember that the interviewer here is your ally. Now we implement and write code for our simplest case solution. And run your code often as you go. Work in very small chunks. And now we really can expand on our code, make it a full, complete solution. You want to do a final checklist. Make a list of edge cases. What the problem wants as output. Many times I have correctly solved the problem, but it wasn't asking me to return a string. It wanted the length of the string and I forgot, and you will get dinged for that. And any other gotchas. And the more you practice this, you'll realize like what your own gotchas and blind spots are. And so I always kind of do like a final checklist. Talk through the solution together. And really, you should be talking the whole time with the interviewer. You want to be really talking out loud as much as possible. If you're stuck, don't go silent. Be like, well, I'm stuck. I'm thinking it might be this, but it might be this. I'm not sure. And try to work it through. And then if you're really stuck, just be like, hey, I'm kind of stuck. What do you think? Because the other piece here is you've got about 40 minutes, 40 to 50 minutes to do this. So part of, to a degree, what you're being assessed on is like time management and not spending like 30 minutes spinning your wheels on one thing. Like it's way better to be like, hey, I realize I see the clock is ticking and I'm stuck on this. Like, what do you want to do? So this is the basic process. You know, there's a little bit like, there's like a couple other odds and ends. Like the most important thing I think is to just always ask the interviewer, you know, whenever you're not sure, like how fancy or complex a solution should I get? Or like, do I want to worry about making this more efficient now? Just ask the interviewer and they'll usually say, just keep it simple. And then when we get it done, let's improve and iterate. Okay, so I've done a lot of talking, but that's sort of like a rough outline of the process. And so I think we'll take a short break for me as well as for you, and then Francisco will basically like interview me, and then I'll kind of put this in action, warts and all. You know, I won't have seen the problem. Hopefully I won't bomb, but if I do bomb, I will follow the process. And that's really the goal of today's practice, is the process. And that's when you all practice these leak code problems, I want you to focus on this process. And we will continue to practice this stuff as we go throughout the course. So what questions do people have before we break about sort of leak code interviews or interviewing or like these whiteboarding problems or this process or anything?
I have a question, Adam. I was curious about when it comes to the interview. So they probably have like a problem, right, that they share with you. Do they typically have like a written out solution that they're looking at as well, or
Yes.
or they, no problem.
Yes, usually, like what really good interviewers and people who interview a lot, they, it depends a little bit on how the company wants to do it, but generally speaking, they'll have a problem that they like. They have the solution to it. They've like studied the problem and they have like variations and follow-ups already like lined up. So it's like a whole thing. But yes, the interviewer will like know the solution and like they're guiding you, and in a perfect world, they know the problem inside and out. Sometimes the interviewer is wrong. Sometimes the interviewer is wrong, or they may not understand what you're doing for some reason, because we're all human and we all make mistakes. So every now and then you have to explain something to the interviewer, and that's another reason to be talking and communicating a lot as well. Yeah, great question, Robert. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
How similar is I guess, the whiteboarding to when we were tested before we actually got into Platoon with Guillermo?
Yeah, it's pretty similar. It's pretty similar, right? Because you had what, like an hour with him to work on a programming problem together? Yeah, it's pretty similar. The problems will be a bit harder. And I think the difference is simply that the expectation for proficiency will be higher because, right, this is interviewing for a job, not like that was the interview to learn these skills. This is the interview to, these skills and you can be productive with them. But the interviewer is still your friend, and that's like, and what Guillermo did is like the essence of the process. And actually, I think what I want to do quickly before we break is just very quickly demo LeetCode. Many of you have seen LeetCode, not everyone, so it's worth a quick walkthrough. So note that the top rated interview question on LeetCode is relatively easy. About half of the programming problems you'll get in interviews will be relatively easy. But just like shooting free throws in the NBA, the anxiety and stress of game day makes something that's normally easy more challenging. So just to kind of like demo the LeetCode platform, we've got our problem here on the left. They always give a couple examples. They give a couple constraints. Sometimes there will be a follow-up. You really shouldn't worry about the follow-up until you get the first implementation working. Over here, you can write your code. You can choose your language. You should always choose the language that you are most comfortable with. That's kind of the standard, is like, it's not the language that the interviewer wants, it's the language you're most comfortable with. Obviously, like if you're applying for a front-end role, it's probably going to be JavaScript because the whole front-end world is JavaScript. But really, like, your language of choice. LeetCode gives you a little bit of skeleton code right here with this class and this method, and you should not rename this method or these arguments because sort of the LeetCode test runner depends on it to do stuff. You've got a console here where, like, if you print stuff, it shows up there. And if I return something, I'm just going to make stuff up here just to have some stuff to return. Where I can run my code. And it'll tell me a wrong answer or not. Note under here, standard out. Standard out is, we haven't really talked about it, but that's the term for what like gets printed to the terminal. So your print statements and stuff are here. You can see here the input, the output. I haven't submitted the problem yet. I just ran it. Over here, you can actually like modify the test cases. I can choose different test cases to use. And I can, in fact, I think create a new test case. Did it let me do that? Yeah. So this is a great tool. This is gonna break it because I have no idea what problem it's looking for. But so you can modify the test cases, and you should add more. And then I can run my code for like a specific test case. So here I'm running it for that case. And like I said, since I just put some random stuff in there, it wasn't going to work. They have reset test cases down here, which is nice. When you're finally done with everything, you can hit submit, and it gets run against a whole lot more test cases. The important thing is that this method returns something. One nice little technique, especially with recursive stuff, is maybe I want to create a class or a method or a recursive method. You know, and I wanted to do stuff. And we'll just put the target in there. And then I just want to return that answer. So if you feel the need, you can totally just use the scaffolding code that LeetCode gives you as like a shell or a wrapper, and like define your own methods or classes or whatever in here to do all the work and return it. That's preferable to like modifying this stuff. And then, you know, when outside the interview context, you can go over here to look at solutions and stuff. And see voted up solutions, code that people have submitted. And that's about it. Any questions about kind of LeetCode and how to use it? Oh, you can do full screen, which is great. You can have some editor shortcuts. I haven't messed around a lot with the settings here, to be honest. You can actually get some pretty neat data, like if you submit the answer, you can see like runtime efficiency and stuff like that. I'm actually not sure where to go to see that. And apparently they now have like video solutions, which is kind of amazing, which goes way into depth. Yeah, any questions about LeetCode?
Is the answer fully submitted when you hit submit, or do you have to add the solution to actually submit it?
When you hit submit, it will run this and run it against all the tests, and LeetCode is expecting this to return the answer, and if it doesn't, it will say, you know, you did not solve the problem. Does that answer your question?
After that point, if you do get the answer correct, it has like an option to add the solution. I'm wondering if the answer's fully like submitted before then, because I was trying to search through some of the ones that I had solved, and it would say the like how many I solved, but I wasn't able to actually like search for them by challenge or anything, or I didn't see how to.
If you don't mind, show me later, because I am actually not sure. Let's actually just take a look at that later, and I can probably help them.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, totally. Sorry that I couldn't answer that one. I really only delved into a lot of the basics of LeetCode. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then Francisco and I will demo this, and then you guys will practice it a bit. All right, thank you everyone, and see you in 10.